Hello, I'm Alan Seaman with the Wheaton College Graduate School, where I'm a professor and program director. I'd like to talk about the topic of creative methodology for faith teaching integration in the Global South. And I'm going to report the results of a decade-long research study I've been doing that is going to be in three parts here very quickly. One, I'd like to talk about the Christian schooling networks that I've been studying and some of the research questions that I've been trying to address. Secondly, I'd like to zero in on two countries, Colombia and Indonesia, where I was documenting classroom practices in the teaching of English. And part three will focus on Nepal and Myanmar, where there are Christ-influenced schools that are reaching their communities. And I'd like to highlight some of the things that they're doing. For many years, really 25, 30 years, I've been studying English language issues in Christian bilingual schools internationally, and I've been in many different parts of the world. Many of these schools have what are known as early immersion models, where if you look at this diagram, you see in the very early grades, maybe pre-K, K up through two or through one, there's a strong heavy immersion in oral English where students are communicating through much of the day in English, try to get them off to a good start with their language acquisition. And then during the elementary grades, most of the content during the day would be taught in the local language or languages, but science might be taught as a content area in English, and then English as foreign language is taught as a subject. And then after about fifth, sixth grade, all the way through high school, English continues to be taught as a subject. And the idea with early immersion is they acquire an early proficiency in English that will serve them well later on. My research questions were, what specific instructional techniques are used to teach English to children in these networks of bilingual schools? I was wanting to document the techniques, the actual methodology, and then look at cultural comparisons. What patterns of similarity or difference can be identified in a comparison of similar groups of teachers in more than one country? And then the question that's most relevant to this presentation, how are Christian teachers integrating a biblical worldview into language and content instruction? To stimulate discussion by focus groups of teachers, I used a methodology based on short videos that documented common teaching practices that I showed the teachers and then they talked about to discuss the similarities or differences between the video and their schools. Here's an example of a preschool level teaching technique.
To the children? Oh, please don't be scared. Say hello to the children.
You can see from that video that it only goes for about a minute, but it does document a common teaching methodology for um, young children where there's an attempt to create an immersion environment by having them interact with a puppet or a stuffed animal, something like that. That's stimulated a lot of discussion among teachers who teach at that level, comparing what they do in the classroom to get the kids listening and talking with what they saw in the video. So that was one of my primary research techniques with groups of teachers to kind of document what they're doing in the classroom. So I'd like to focus on classroom practices in Colombia and Indonesia. I worked with a network in Colombia called OBED, which is a number of Christian schools throughout the country who are joining together to share knowledge and support each other, visiting schools in disadvantaged areas as well as fairly wealthy or affluent areas of the country, and looking at individual classrooms. You can see on the lower left side one of these focus groups of teachers looking at the video you just observed and then having a discussion about it as a methodology. I also spent a lot of time in the schools observing classes and talking with individual teachers, carefully documenting and recording everything I saw. I did the exact same thing in Indonesia through a series of trips, looking at schools in a variety of different parts of the country, mostly in Java, but also drawing teachers from other islands who came in for conferences and had focus groups using the exact same methodology, looking at the videos and then talking about what they do. Some interesting patterns emerged. I don't have time to talk about everything, but I'd like to highlight a couple of interesting patterns. We had a heavy emphasis on drama as a means of instruction in Colombia. For instance, a quote to quote a teacher, the project of these lessons is to make a video in which they're going to show to a situation of the shopping center. And they make a list of expressions they could use when they're writing the dialogue, and then they are going to record it in the video. So drama showed up again and again and again in the conversations in Colombia. And a pattern that showed up in Indonesia was storytelling. It's summarized in this quote from a teacher. A lot of children don't want to learn from textbooks. It's boring for them, but I realized that through storytelling, English became relevant. Kids became motivated and actively participated in the stories. Oral storytelling is a tradition in Indonesia, but has become less important over generations. We're helping to revive that, and it helps the children to learn and identify with their culture. So these kinds of things became the basis for a lot of biblical integration in these cultures. For instance, Bible stories. A quote from a teacher, it's really easy to include Bible stories into the math overview. I feel really comfortable with that. I don't feel like I have to be forced to do it. It just, comes along, kind of as a natural part of the culture. Or practices such as prayer in English integrated into instruction. A teacher said, when we are practicing English, we start by praying. Everything is in English because my focus is on creating a Christian and English environment for all the classes. We also have emphasis on values-based instruction that shows up in various ways. Here's a teacher talking about biblical worldview integration in science. And she says, in our schools, we try to incorporate the biblical worldview, but we do not think it will be every day after the lesson of science. For example, with biomes, the unit that we just taught, maybe it is in the beginning and also at the end of the unit that we incorporate the biblical worldview. But what is more important is the biblical worldview in our experiences. What are the values, the core values in our philosophy of learning? Or questions used to stimulate values-based discussions, where this teacher says, I start with questions that they discuss first, and then I give a response, and then they also sometimes respond. So later on, we just talk about those values. We just talk. This can be integrated into grammar and oral communication in lessons. A few quick examples here for grammar instruction. For example, if I'm talking about past tenses, I underline. So maybe I found a verse that says maybe, for example, Jesus was walking, and they are going to recognize that structure in the Bible. I found a very interesting thing happening with preaching and translation in several schools in Colombia that were training the kids to work bilingually as translators or interpreters. Here's an example. Not only make them speak with the language to be understood, but also try to be able to bring the gospel when they have the opportunity to translate. So that was the motivation for becoming bilingual. We surround them with little opportunities to teach them how important it is not only to speak, but also to be able to translate to another audience, maybe through visitors to their churches in other contexts, which would require translation to an English speaker. And finally, there was quite a bit of discussion of biblical integration with the content areas. Here are some examples of this. A teacher said, last year I was teaching science and English about the parts of the body. So I explained that our bodies are temple of the Holy Spirit, that they have to have good habits. In my class, eat good food is one of our rules. And then she shared about a cooking competition. And another teacher responded by saying, yes, I motivate them to have lunch, to have dinner with healthy food. And for example, with parts of the body that they are unique, they have to respect themselves and it is an excellent opportunity to teach them about the Christian view of sexuality. And she goes on to talk about how they did that in the context of separate groups of boys and girls in her school, giving them clear guidelines and helping them encourage self-respect and respect of others. I'd like to conclude by highlighting some schools that were holistically reaching their communities in two very different countries, Nepal and Myanmar. I was conducting a research project in these countries just this fall using very similar methodology to what I just described in Indonesia and Colombia. A lot of classroom observation, focus groups of teachers and administrators, and a number of other things that surveys, for instance, were documenting what the schools were doing. These are countries where Christians are a very small percentage of the population. So the schools are startups, they're less developed, but they're really focused on quality instruction, caring teachers, and reaching the community. One exemplary school in Kathmandu was Life Prep Academy. It was located in a community that had been wiped out recently through a flood. The school wasn't harmed, but many homes in the community were. And the teachers and the administrators and even some of the students in the school reached out to the community in a variety of ways, housing kids in dormitories that had lost their homes to flooding, providing after school support and training to adults, providing for material needs to families that had lost their homes and possessions. So the school was ideally positioned to make an impact on the community for Christ. In Yangon, which is a war-torn, it's in Myanmar, a war-torn country, there are many internally displaced people. People coming into Yangon, the most important commercial city, used to be known as Rangoon. They're coming from the other provinces of Myanmar, fleeing the war. And so there are over 3 million people in the city who are internally displaced. Many of these people have kids that don't have any opportunity for schooling. And so there are Christ-influenced schools run by churches and Christians reaching out to internally displaced people, providing them with uniforms, computers, and quality education, and opportunities to use English in worship, devotionals, even though they may be coming from a variety of religious backgrounds. I'd like to conclude by just showing a chapel singing in English a service that was conducted in one of these schools. So to just conclude, Christian schooling really faces different challenges in places like Colombia, which is a Christian dominant culture, versus Indonesia, Nepal, and Myanmar, where other religions such as Islam or Buddhism are dominant. Um, Also, we want to do true biblical integration, not just tagging on scriptures or something superficial. Many teachers mentioned that as they talked about integration of faith and teaching. And there are many challenges to overcome: large classes, war zones, persecution, a national curriculum. But there was tremendous creativity and resourcefulness, and including an emphasis on experiential learning that was taking place in these schools. And then finally, as I mentioned, Christ-influenced schools can holistically reach their communities as a significant witness through their position within the community. So I have three discussion questions, and I want to hear what your experiences are. Which of these techniques is familiar to you, and how have you used them in your context? Does the integration of the Christian faith and worldview occur naturally in these activities, or could it be improved? And then finally, if you can, provide an example of how you can integrate faith and learning in your own context. Thank you very much. And I look forward to hearing what you have to say as we continue the discussion.